President Cyril Ramaphosa will deliver his sixth State of the Nation address on Thursday, where he'll set out government's priorities for the next year. The event will be held at the Cape Town City Hall after Parliament was gutted in a blaze early last month. Well, let's talk about what should form part of the President's agenda, at least top of his priority list. Development economist Pelisa Ngomo and SAFTU General Secretary Zwelinzi Mavavi join us tonight. Good evening to both of you, and thanks for your time. The mere fact of the aesthetics of it all, the fact that the State of the Nation address will be taking place at the City Hall and not in Parliament, is perhaps the biggest demonstration of just where we are as a country, that things are not the way that they should be. Pelisa, let me begin with you. What does the President need to say to instill a level of confidence in South Africa that he can steer us back onto the path of prosperity for all South Africans?
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good evening to the listeners. Perhaps even before we can start talking about what is it that the President needs to say, let's talk about the three things he had promised to deliver last year in the previous State of the Nation address. So the first one, he had spoken about increased access to vaccination and dealing with the COVID. So currently we have less than 40% of South Africans who are actually vaccinated. So I think the issue of vaccine equity is something that needs to be, he probably needs to really articulate and say what is the plan going forward. The second one is really about dealing with corruption. So you had, I think just last month, we've had two reports. In fact, in the last 2 months, the Zondo Commission had presented its report, part 1 and part 2, and as well as the SIU. And I think part of what the President needs to articulate in the State of the Nation address is exactly what's going to happen with those reports and what are the plans in place with regards to those who are implicated. Because, I mean, it's not like the President is really starting to govern, or is becoming the President for the first time. I think the third one, which is very thorny, is actually in economic reforms. The President had made commitments on economic reforms. You have just read now, a few minutes ago, about Eskom crisis. I suppose I'm quite pleased. I suppose all South Africans are pleased to hear that Eskom is going to start instituting consequence management in relation to the issue of load shedding and just the general poor, management of the of Eskom, because Eskom is a backbone of the economy. When everyone else wakes up in the morning, from children want to have to go to school, they need access to warm water, to warm meals, and at the same time, you also need people to start getting connected. If, for example, electricity goes off now, we won't be able to even have this conversation. So the President is really on the back foot, where he's also going to be, presenting, his SONA on the back of a GDP growth projections that are less than 2%, for instance. So there are several things that the President needs to do. I think one of the critical areas, I think the economic discourse is going to be, a glue that's going to hold everybody else. South Africans, about 3 million, if not above, have lost jobs, the unemployment. And that's why there's a very strong call for basic income grant. So he needs to articulate how is he going to provide safety net to South Africans at the same time, and ensuring that state-owned enterprises that are meant to be the lifeline of this economy are actually going to become on track. And now I'm going to probably come back and talk about the specific things, which amongst those should be the investment in public infrastructure, which is massive opportunity with multiplier effects in the economy.
Mr. Vavi, let me give you an opportunity to come in here. Some have said that this is going to be one of the toughest State of the Nation addresses that the President will have to deliver, and have emphasized the need for him to also talk about what is going to be done to ensure that the vulnerabilities in security are going to be attended to.
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know. There's a toying on my side by my laptop. Can you still see me or hear anything from me?
We can hear you, Mr. Vavi.
Okay. I was going to say, look, he has a very, very difficult story to tell tomorrow or on Thursday. because everything is falling apart under his watch. Unemployment have risen to 46%, but more worryingly, unemployment have now reached 55% for two of the country's provinces, the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, and unemployment have now reached 77% of the population of the young people below the age of 24, and more than 50% of black women are unemployed in our country. And the story about the economic reforms have been sold to South Africans since time immemorial. Nothing is coming out of that commitment, and the crisis is deepening. The economy continues to reproduce that unemployment, poverty, inequality. He is a slave of neoliberalism and the prescriptions of the IMF, World Bank, and the rating agencies. He's not going to change tack and to admit that what these guys in New York are telling him that it will eventually work, the trickle-down economic policies are not working and will not work in the context of South Africa with such a massive backlog in economic development. So that's the first crisis the president will have to articulate. To come back and say we now have a deal from NEDLEC, there's another reform coming, will simply not be believed by South Africa. And secondly, he does this address in the background of a massive humiliating defeat in the local government election, where his party lost more metros, precisely because of the relationship between the crisis of poverty, unemployment, inequality, and the confidence our people have generally on the political system. Now, 70% of the population simply refuses to endorse any of the political parties, despite a longer list, now 600 or so parties in the country, and all of them can't be trusted, are not voted for by ordinary people. And secondly, he is not going to, unfortunately, go and look at the root causes of this deepening crisis of poverty, inequality, and unemployment in our country. He is not going to go and instruct the minister to say, Minister of Public Education, look at why our country continues to climb down in the ladder if you compare it with the rest of the countries, why our kids are unable to compete in terms of reading, in terms of mathematics, with their counterparts everywhere else in the world.
Sure.
Which is why our kids, almost 50% of them do not reach grade 12 within the prescribed years of 12 years in the basic education system. That's the crisis that is reproducing poverty, unemployment in the country. And for 27 years, our politicians have taken out their kids from the public education system and left the poor on their own devices.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I want to bring in Ms. Nkomo on this issue of just what is happening in our society. Of course, by last year already, the conversation around extending social security to the majority of South Africans began. Well, let me not say they began, but they really became a central focus of whether or not there should be a basic income grant or an extension of the social relief of distress grant that had been initially implemented for some months then. How do you see that conversation finding legs in the State of the Nation address?
Well, I mean, I think as part of my first comment, I said, the president will have to articulate what type of safety net is he going to be providing for South African citizens who are vulnerable, who are impacted very badly by poverty, unemployment, and continuously trapped in both income and social inequality. So the president will have to outline what type of safety net. You recall, Casey, that right in the peak of COVID, there was a COVID grant, which were given to, struggling, households, which kind of like really made, some form of a relief at household level. But I think going forward, the president will have to make a commitment about the basic income grant. but also with other plethora of structural reforms that are in place. Because also, already if you have 17 million South Africans who are in the social security system, but also you have young people who are capable. I think Budzweli makes the point about young people who are unemployed, who are actually sitting at more than 70% right now. So you need young people to be able to ensure that they are intellectually engaged. So one of the key things you need to then start kicking in a structural reform program, which the president had actually, committed to last year. That as citizens are collecting basic income grant, but also here's the public works program that needs to come through. But also, what other structural reforms that the president needs to announce? One of those, for example, is issues around access to finance. A lot of small medium enterprises, for example, are really battling, but we have development finance institutions who either unable to spend their funding, but also had set up, high thresholds for access to finance. And that's a serious structural issue because, a lot of them are unable to secure funding from the mainstream bank. I think the other issue is access to markets. Now, one of the key issues, and I think amongst the economists that we support is basic income grant. But at the same time, we're saying, while South Africa may be confronted with a crisis of a demand, right? You also don't want the public sector money funds that get spent on social security get spent on the very same, oligopolistic markets that we have. I don't know if you followed the report that was issued by the Competition Commission last year, where they actually, spell out, companies that are dominating several sectors. So if you then look at the, capital flow, in fact, government is meant to provide relief to poor households, but in fact, the very, oligopolistic organized economy extracts that money out of those communities. So, and that's why you actually need a very clear and committed, concomitant plan around structural reform. And so I speak about the access to funds. The other one, actually, that is a massive opportunity. The president needs to make a call on the private sector to start opening up their supply chain opportunities.
All right. Unfortunately, it looks like we've lost Ms. Nkomo there. Let me come to you then, Mr. Vavi, just to wrap up this conversation. One of the big issues that has been brought up is the budget allocations, and I know that that's something that the Minister, Inoko Dongwana, will deal with in his budget address, but certainly the State of the Nation address provides some kind of foundation for what the approach government overall is going to be taking and where the spending should be going.
Unfortunately, the dice has been cast already. We've listened to the medium-term policy budget statement that was made by the minister in November last year. He was building on the foundation of the previous minister, Tito Mboweni, and who also is copycatting the previous ministers of finance. The current minister admits that the only difference between him and the previous minister, Tito Mboweni, is the shoes, nothing else. So we expect hell for the poor. We expect that the government will continue to cut heavily on all of the areas of expenditure that will impact so direly on the lives of the poor. The education expenditure will be cut heavily, the public health care, and as a result of the cuts in education, public health care, and policing, including social services, we expect a government that is unable to fill the vacancies in the public schools, public hospitals, public police stations, that is unable to buy the necessary infrastructure and equipment that the police, the nurses, the doctors, the teachers are needing at a time when we are unable to break the backbone of the reality that most black schools have no laboratories, have no libraries, and are still using latrine toilets 27 years into democracy. So unfortunately, that's what we're facing. And so on Thursday, SAFTU is picketing outside the City Hall to try and draw the attention of the country to the fact that there has been no real reforms. There have been no restructuring of the economy. The apartheid colonial economy inherited from our past remains intact, and as a result, black people continue to be the face of poverty, unemployment, inequalities, 27 years after their promise, or the promise made to them to build a better life for all. We will do the same thing on the 23rd of February. We will be outside that city hall in mass to say you can't be solving the crisis of global capitalism at the back of the poor in our country. Not at the time when you have promised them decent jobs, not at the time you have promised them that you will insource them, but we're seeing massive outsourcing of services in government everywhere, left, right, and center. So we want everybody who would identify with the need for the introduction of the basic income grant to join those demonstrations to say enough is enough.
SAFTU General Secretary Zwelinzima Mavavi, and we also heard there from development economist Pelisa Nkomo.